Welcome to Asset Leadership Network Thursday at 4. Thank you all for being here on this August 27th, 2020. I'm Nick Kanoki, the producer of ALN Thursday at 4, where every Thursday at 4 we put a light on important and relevant asset leadership and asset management topics. One note before we begin, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat so we can answer them at the end or more presently. And now, without further ado, let me introduce Mike Bordenaro and Moshe Nelson.
Hi, thank you, Nick. Before we get started, I want to do a special shout out to Giuliani and Associates. Joe Giuliani is doing great work with his team there to help us with production. And I'm very happy today to be speaking with Moshe Nelson, and it's great to be involved with somebody who says some of the things that I think, and that doesn't happen too often in meetings. So really appreciate him being involved in Asset Leadership Network. And we like to start off by finding out how people got involved in this level of their asset management journey.
Sure. Well, Mike and ALN and all members, thank you so much for inviting me and taking the time to listen today and then have a good dialogue. So that's a great question. You know, how did we come to asset management, or how did I get to asset management? And you know, quite frankly, I'm in management consulting. I'm a principal with Grant Thornton, and years ago, I was assigned to a client that, you know, within their asset management division, who had issues with their fleet program or the property program. They were walking in new to the division, and you know, they needed a smart management consultant to come in and help assess it. And you know, that really started my journey in asset management, seeing how you can make such a significant impact with a client. And this was within the federal government, and I saw when you change the tangible artifacts on the ground and the assets that are being utilized to, you know, in this case, achieve the mission, you can really affect people's lives. You can affect the world, and you know, really gained a passion for asset management as a result, and started tying those pieces together and applying it in different places, and watching and seeing the impact for the general public, the private sector, healthcare. It's just really amazing the reach that you have in the asset management community. So that was how I got into it.
How did you find out about ISO 55000?
Oh, it's a great question. So a little bit of luck, where you know, we were one of my colleagues was at a conference and had met Jack Kelly, who was at a similar conference, and you know, I think they were both waiting in the hall for a session to start, and struck up a conversation. And you know, Jack quickly introduced, I mean, you got to give Jack credit, someone who can introduce 55,000 to, and this person was not an asset management practitioner, and get them to become a believer within minutes.
That's our Jack.
Yeah, Jack met my colleague and said, hey, you need to meet Moshe. He leads our asset management practice. This was years ago now. And I think you'll share common beliefs on, you know, how to improve asset management in the system. So it was that introduction, and then you know, integrating into Asset Leadership Week, where you know, I met a lot of people with common thoughts.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to be talking about your work with the National Asset Leadership Strategy at ALN, and your work with the ALN's Federal Law Enforcement Group. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at Grant Thornton?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, I'm a principal at Grant Thornton. I manage our asset management solutions, and what that is essentially our solution set within the public sector. So you know, asset management in private sector finance is an entirely different story. We're talking about physical assets here, of course, and it's all our services focused within the facilities, property, you know, even digital asset environment. So I lead teams across the federal government, from civilian to defense and intelligence, to be able to provide services that improve asset management. And at times it's helping clients, well, I should say it's always helping clients think through asset management in terms of ISO 55000. At times it's tactically helping them develop new technologies to better manage assets, data analytics, supply chain management, vendor management. So I oversee the development of new solutions, our teams, and then ensuring that we can continuously serve our clients well and bring them the best services and across the federal sector.
Well, that explains why you jumped into the national asset leadership strategy so quickly and so forcefully. You understand its value. So why don't you explain to people how the national asset leadership strategy is developing now? There's quite a history, but where is it as of our meeting earlier today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll give 30 seconds on the history, and this has to do with the perception that we as asset management practitioners, have in the world. We walk around with asset management goggles on, right? Wherever we go, we start to see things on how the assets are depreciating before our eyes or being invested in, right? We drive over a road and we're wondering how long it's been there, when the refresh rate is, so on and so forth.
Yes.
So when we started the NALS, the National Asset Leadership Strategy, over a year now, it was really with the understanding of the importance that asset management has on achieving national objectives, right? And helping the country and the United States bring together the assets and industries and private and public sector in a way that achieves national objectives, national asset management objectives as well. So our NALS 1 effort was about launching ISO 55000 and its relationship with national asset management. It's really an educational process. And that was, I think, very successful. We had a great review from Bloomberg, and it was met with a lot of positive reception at the Hill. But the question was, now what, right? So what do we do with this knowledge? The ISO 55000 exists, but what does that matter? So NALS 2 is essentially the so what, right? It's taking the principles of ISO 55000 and focusing them on sector-specific areas so that we can provide actionable decisions to important constituents. And those constituents may be policy, they may be the general public, private, public sector. So it's just, it's essentially step 2. And the so what? What do we do now knowing that ISO 55000 can make a significant impact on the national economy, on the health and safety of the United States, on disaster preparedness, right?
Yeah, my thought is the strategy is on the big level, use ISO 55000, because that could be the national strategy wherever you can. Of course, that's too simple and clean, but the team is working to establish some of the key benefits, the main points, and then put together, compile the list of people who are actively doing this already, so that we can go to, like you said, all the different constituents, bring them that information. So it's a really complex process.
Yeah.
Do you take something as complex as a national strategy that hasn't existed before and write it in a way that people will say, yeah, this makes sense? What are some of the techniques and approaches that the team is using?
Yeah, I think the first part is making sure that we have a diverse constituency that's contributing to the development of national asset leadership strategy. So breaking it apart into focused areas like sectors, and then ensuring that there's representation from within that sector, whether it's academia, private sector, and public sector, is the first part, right? Identifying who are the right individuals that can provide input that matter, that will result in actionable decisions. You're going to say
Anybody interested
something?
can send an email to info@assetleadership.net and put NALS in the subject line and we'll get you involved.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then the next piece is creating that framework, really developing the questions that help guide a small user group or a team to impart their knowledge, right? Their perspectives on why it matters, why their sector matters, whether it's the energy sector or the water sector, and what is the need, right? That starting with that problem statement, what are the problems that exist within this sector? And I'll be talking about law enforcement, and we'll get into federal law enforcement. We'll get into that in a bit, and then determining how you can use the construct of 55,000 to be able to improve that sector. It's thinking in terms of the attributes of 55,000 with data, metrics, risk, vision, value, things of that nature.
The ability to demonstrate how to spend money better. There's
Right.
actual mechanisms in there to show that we can use the resources that we have already and get more, maximize the value out of it.
That's right.
That's good. The NOWS is taking an important role in the Fall Forum Restructuring America, which will be starting in October. We'll have sector programs of 90 minutes for throughout October. You can also go to the website www.assetleadership.net to find out more about that. So how is NOWS helping shape the forum and guiding some of the discussion that will be occurring there?
Yeah, well, I think what the NOWS is doing is allowing us to think beforehand of, what are the changes necessary, as we move into 2021, and address institutional problems that have existed in the asset management environment, right, for some time. We're in a strategic pause. Well, I call it a strategic pause, but this is the big pause, right? With COVID-19, people are at an inflection point. And just naturally, due to the cyclical nature of administrations and changes, this is the time where no matter what political parties in the White House come 2021, you start over, right? There's another 4 years of executing upon a strategy. So at this point, if we're talking about the nows now and taking advantage of that strategic pause to think of how do we apply the best practices in 55,000 to line up any transition to be effective in 2021, then we're using time wisely, and I think effectively, given where we're at.
Yeah, in just a second, we'll be talking about a sector, the federal law enforcement asset management sector. But let's give the viewers an example of a sector that could use a national strategy. We were talking today at our NOWS meeting about water, clean water, and everyone's familiar with Flint, Michigan. But not everybody realizes that Flint, Michigan is one of only thousands of municipalities in the country that has lead problems. That is clearly a national problem. And without a strategy for addressing this, there will be not as effective use of the resources. So the water sector, water and wastewater sector, will be addressing some of that. So why don't we talk a little bit about the federal law enforcement group that you set up, and then about how it's going to be a demonstration of, once there's a strategy, how does the sector respond?
Yeah, well, late last calendar year, we were able to bring together stakeholders who, you know, at all levels of the organizations hadn't really been able to work with each other on the level that they wanted to, or they can, just due to time and institutional constraints of agencies. So,
What kind of stakeholders?
yeah, so we stood up a federal law enforcement asset management working group, and it's essentially asset management practitioners from across federal law enforcement agencies who
Such as?
such as we had representation from ATF, ICE, CBP, DHS, or rather, Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Department of Justice, Federal Bureau
FBI
of
too,
Investigation.
right?
I'm sorry?
FBI?
Yes, FBI too.
Yeah. So just so people understand the type of stakeholders. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a diverse group of stakeholders with very different missions, even though they all, operate in a law enforcement environment between Department of Justice and Homeland Security, and as well as agriculture, right? Forest Service, Forest Service, I know has a law enforcement arm. And what we've done and what I've been able to see, being at Grant Thornton for 14 years and working in this environment, were common problems that existed, or that exist rather, for many of these organizations. And we coalesce them together so that practitioners at the same level can meet one another in an environment where we're discussing, asset management best practices. And we had speakers at our event, which were fantastic, that were able to bring real life examples, as well as show what technology, what's the evolution of asset management innovation that can be brought into the federal law enforcement arena, given the unique aspects of their missions. And one thing that's extremely unique that the federal law enforcement asset management community has been facing is, for years, the idea of resiliency and agility, right? The lives, the operations of federal law enforcement agencies change, rapidly across geographies, across seasons, at any given time. So asset management, yeah, I mean, think about it. I mean, asset management has to be extremely dynamic to be able to respond to changes that are occurring, and those changes can be, based upon environmental factors like a hurricane. I lived through Hurricane Andrew back in the early '90s in South Florida, and there were significant humanitarian as well as law enforcement concerns when all of the power goes out, right? All of your infrastructure shuts down, and you need to make sure that basic operations can occur, and that things are safe, and the general public is able to live their lives. So it's always been a very dynamic environment, which is why I love operating and working with it. And fantastic clients that are just used to change. And as a change maker, and as a management consultant, that's the world I live in, right? Nothing is static.
Yeah.
And the idea of ISO 55000 that creates the framework in which you can manage change, you can prepare for change, it makes complete sense. So we brought these stakeholders together. They were able to meet each other, and an immediate benefit was collaborate through informal connections as well as formal connections, and and then ostensibly look towards making a more concerted effort to integrate 55,000 principles, and we see that happening. So
can you give us an example?
Sure. Well, we talked about certain Department of Homeland Security agencies have started to adopt ISO 55,000 principles, right?
Awesome.
Yeah, and we've seen presentations on the implementation of metrics-based decisions, data-based decisions, looking at the entire ecosystem. I think DHS has come a long way in being able to have coordinated efforts again across diverse stakeholders like FEMA, as well as CBP or Coast Guard or FPS. Right?
Mhm.
These are all
Mhm.
very dynamic and diverse constituencies. So as 55,000 knowledge has made its way across the federal government, it's being adopted and then integrated into operations slowly, right? It is a big beast, and it's a process, but at least it provides that vision.
Okay, so there's been great traction from the start. What do you think the law enforcement group will be able to demonstrate or show related to the National Asset Leadership Strategy? Or
Yeah,
it has to evolve with the team and you don't want to be seeding it?
sure. I think no, it's a great question, and this time of the year everybody's busy, sort of closing out the end of the fiscal year. But what I would guess, based upon the discussions that we had at the end of last calendar year, is greater collaboration and best practice sharing in the areas that are relevant to ISO 55000 and strategic asset management planning, right? So what are those areas on risk, on common metrics, on standards, taxonomy? I think we're going to see more of that communication and then benefits being achieved across stakeholder groups within the community. So that's what I will guess, because I know that they've individually have come along since we last met, and there will be a lot more of that probably best practice sharing and continued collaboration and communication. That's just my guess.
Excellent. Yeah, they all have different missions, but they all drive vehicles. So
That's right.
be a lot that is shared, on just that one
Well,
basic
vehicles and boats and aircraft and
right.
buildings and technology. Yeah.
So really quickly, I want to thank you for earlier this year when we were involved in presentations on personal protective equipment. And can you say a little bit about what might be helpful in the future so that we can have face masks or
Yeah.
things like any thoughts on how that has developed or could be improved in terms of federal?
Yeah, I think, and I'll speak generally, even beyond federal, because I have seen a bit in the private sector, healthcare, as well as state and local. The trend that we saw with personal protective equipment, or PPE, initially when COVID broke out, was a bit of trying to understand what was the infrastructure, what were the data, what were the processes in place to first account for the PPE, right? So that you can ensure you knew how much you have. And then how does the supply chain look? What is the vendor base? How do I get PPE on contract? What are some of the holdups as a result of borders essentially shutting down due to COVID-19 health risks? In some cases, obviously opening back up later, but at a slower throughput. So in the first part of this pandemic, there was just trying to get the lay of the land, understand what systems and data and processes exist. Then we saw, basically an understanding of where everyone was at. And, many agencies in the federal government were able to quickly get their resources coalesced together and, establish processes, analytical capabilities, forecasting capabilities, and vendor relationships fairly quickly for those that were collaborating, right? Which was very interesting. I think as we move into the fall, and we can expect an additional uptick as just a result of we're getting to seasonality. That's a guess, right? I'm not in the healthcare sector, but that's what the literature is saying.
Mhm.
There'll be less of trying to get a bearing of how are we managing this as asset management practitioners, because we now know there are, in many cases, there are processes in place, and there'll be I think further investments or resources made to ensure that the supply chain of PPE is better sought out, better managed, and more collaboration occurring between organizations. And I think that's the piece that we're at, right? So during the height of the pandemic, at least from the initial outsets, people were trying to understand and gain resources so that they can complete, the healthcare jobs or the missions within the federal government or state and local services. There was a little bit of now rebaselining and understanding this is actually what we need, because in some cases we figured out we can operate in a remote environment. We don't need to all be in this building. Therefore, we all do not need this amount of PPE. Let's adjust that factor. Let's order more or order less, and allow for redistribution of resources across the supply chain. So I think that all of that is coming together now, and will be factors that we'll have to deal with as we come into the fall, but thinking through those problems.
Not very passionate on the subject, are you?
It's a lot of great people working on it, and I know I can't tell you how many hours and weeks, nights and weekends people have spent, just making sure that everyone is safe. And people have really sacrificed health, family, and a lot of sacrifice just to be able to help others. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for your work on that. And I think Nick has some questions.
I do. Thank you so much so far, Moshe. And if we have a few questions, and if you wouldn't mind trying to respond to them, in a minute or so. The first one is, do you think that for asset management to be nationally successful, it needs a supportive financial accounting system? That is, the basis of accounting should/could be accrual, not cash, question mark.
Yeah, well, there's so many aspects to that question, and I'm not an accountant, so I'm not, I do work for an accounting firm, but I'm not a CPA. I will put that out up front. But one of the biggest issues that I've seen across client bases is that asset management systems and financial management systems are different, and clients are essentially running their assets in one system that's not tying to the financial management system of record. So when you're going through the inventory, or you're trying to depreciate assets with ease, it's extremely challenging. And it's extremely challenging to account for on an annual basis, because of what is a technology system issue, partly, right? So there is significant opportunity to improve the accounting of assets based upon some technological improvements and standardization of systems in and of themselves, and the processes by which those systems exist. And I can tell you that money is poured into audit remediation efforts across the United States because of that fundamental issue of technological systems not talking to one another. So I think that this question also hits upon how the assets are being managed, and how asset management offices work with the finance offices, typically separate, to account for these assets on the books. And it's extremely challenging for many stakeholders who don't have that unified system. And I'm not plugging any specific software. There are great softwares out there. There are great systems. That alone does not solve it. The accounting is necessary to make it beneficial. And the processes in themselves, but we have to recognize the problem.
Thank you so much for taking that question. And I just want to briefly say that our 30 minutes is up. So if people have to go, that's fine. But I'm going to stay and ask another question or two, if that's okay with you, Moshe.
Sure, of course.
One question is, how do you think asset management will have to adapt going forward with the world different as we're experiencing COVID-19?
I think that there is a rare moment where asset managers or people that work within asset management have the ability to shine during COVID-19. And it's one of the most, you know, beneficial things that I have done in my career has been during this period where we've been able to help through asset management practices, through 55,000, through our knowledge of infrastructure and analytics, field PPE, for example, to the places that need it most at the time that they need it. So that's one answer. The second piece to that goes back to the agility and the resiliency that's necessary. So asset management itself will have to become a more resilient and nimble planning operation, right? Oftentimes we think of 30-year capital plans, which are necessary, right, to make large-term investments and receive payback. But we also have to take into account the changing and dynamic nature that COVID-19 has made people aware of. And if you've worked at all within the federal government for the past decade, you would know that it has become less of a fluid environment, right? Government shutdowns, operating on continuing resolutions, the need to become agile to respond to how the operations have been undertaken within the asset management environment has become a necessity, not a choice. So I think that's going to be one of the primary changes to the asset management practice is the ability to be more agile, to think in scenarios rather than in long-term, finite plans. Makes
The
sense?
interesting thing about COVID is that it's done it on a national and global level.
Right.
We have been seeing the situational requirements for that agility, like you mentioned, Sandy, and just today, Laura. We're seeing the fires and the floods, but this is getting us a national focus. And it's bold to say it, but I think the Asset Leadership Network has an answer for how to proceed into this new world. And that's through a systematic, standardized approach to asset management. So,
well, Mike, and I would also say, and this was amazing during the webinar we did with the healthcare facilities that were, there were constituents located in California, and we were able to quickly share best practices related to asset management, things that we're doing here on the East Coast that people could start applying tomorrow, right? So I think ALN provides that collaborative environment where individuals can share best practices, can collaborate on resourcing effectively in this environment. And that says a lot about the organization.
Well, thank you for being a strong and powerful advocate for the organization. Look forward to continuing working with you and more discussions. We'll have to have you back on Thursday at 4 in the future.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is it's always a great opportunity to speak with you guys.
Do you have time for one or two more questions? Or?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. One question was, how can we depoliticize asset management, and can ISO 55,000 help with that?
Yeah, well, it's amazing because the infrastructure bills on the Hill tend to be the most bipartisan bills that are put out there. So if there's any area within industry that you can reach common ground, it's assets, right? It's asset management. Now, I'm sure there's different variants of which assets you're talking about or what to focus on, one item at a time. But I think that the work through the National Asset Leadership Strategy, the NALS, where we're talking about how do you put a prioritization methodology in place that is not based upon, necessarily subjective measures, and those can be political or they can be otherwise, but based upon what's necessary to achieve national objectives. That's how you get to a nonpartisan approach. And it's, it's putting that accountability, that methodology in place where you eliminate the subjectivity. So that would be my recommendation. I think
Great.
we're doing it. Yeah.
Great. And last question, is it too complex to appoint city mayors, for example, to use the ASTM's E3210 on infrastructure management and its support of the ISO 55000 to address the current zeitgeist to defund the police? Is it too political? That was a question.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think anytime, what I can say as part of that question, anytime you could recommend best practice principles of ASTM or ISO 55000 for asset management, period, it's good. Right? It's going to help asset management. Now, as far as political decision making or preferences, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll leave the political side of that alone, but let me do address that the ASTM E3210 is a standard about how to unify your thinking about multiple municipal asset classes. So it totally fits in with ISO 55000 in multiple ways. One, it says that the city is an owner and it has assets, and it shouldn't think of buses separate from bridges and trains. They should think in terms of, we need to move people through the city so that they can achieve their missions, live their lives, and do their business. And the taxonomy that's in the National Asset Leadership Strategy will be helpful in guiding people who use E3210 and use ISO 55000 together, because this is about systems thinking. And that standard is very good of laying out the municipal assets, including education is one of the assets that they list in that. Not the buildings, but education of the people. So that's being spearheaded by ALN senior fellow Marty Rowland, who's really far advanced in thinking about complex things that many people can't even get their heads around.
Yeah.
But,
thank you, Marty.
Yeah, go Marty.
Well, we're out of questions and out of time, so I just wanted to share this screen again. Motion Nelson, thank you so much for being here. And again, I don't know if I said this initially, but these are our organizational members. This wouldn't be possible without them. Thank you all so much for coming and being here today. If you want to continue any of these conversations, feel free to reach out to us personally or email us at webinar@assetleadership.net.